Moist, you asked, what effect does toxicity have on people? And I think, you can hear it from the different streamers. So I think it does a couple of things. The first is that, so when it comes to people who aren't streamers, sometimes I encounter it. So generally speaking, what I encounter has changed drastically over the last couple of years. And so most of my practice used to be like dealing with people who had like jobs and stuff like that. But what I found about, especially with like online bullying, is like in some ways it's way worse. And the reason is because like I used to get bullied all the time in school, and then school would end, and then I would go home, and then I wouldn't have to see the bully until tomorrow. And even then, like most of the time I'm sitting in class, it's really like research and lunchtime that I had to be careful. And that's changed now, right? Because like Amaranth said, everything is right here, which also means that the first thing that you do when you wake up in the morning is you open your phone and you see like hateful messages. Before you go to bed at night, open your phone, you see hateful messages.
Yep.
So sometimes, I mean, that is just psychological torture that you can't get away from for some people. Especially teenagers, like sometimes like that results in actually like suicide and things like that. I mean, cyberbullying is terrifying because you can't escape from your bully. So what effect does it have on people? So if you're young and unprepared, you get owned, basically. It tears you apart, right? Like, so we have, and this is also like kind of a broader thing about social media. So as human beings, we have a sense of self-worth. And generally speaking, that sense of self-worth somehow correlates with the outside world. So imposter syndrome is when the outside sense of self-worth rises way faster than the inside sense of self-worth. So there's a discrepancy where like suddenly everyone's treating you like you're the hottest shit, and you don't feel like you're the hottest shit, and then you feel like you're an imposter. The opposite can also happen where like you can have a good sense of yourself and everyone's treating you like shit. You can sort of like start to question that, and then you can be concerned about it. You can start to believe it. I think what tends to happen with most streamers is that they learn to adapt. Like it's like the ones that survive are the ones that learn how to psychologically protect themselves. And usually it's through a couple of things. One is that they separate their identities. So there's Dr. K and there's Alok. And the way that I can sleep at night is the person that they hate, or I tend to be pretty lucky so far. So love is Dr. K and I'm just Alok. And so like the hate doesn't apply to me or the love doesn't apply to me. It applies to like my streamer personality. And me as a human being is like somewhat separate. So, it's kind of like invalidating their criticism in some way by like separating out identities. The other thing that happens, which I think is probably true, is that, like people are saying, they recognize that there's like, it doesn't make sense for them to really hate the person that you are.
Right.
They hate some slice of what they think you are.
Yeah.
The hate isn't even, you're just like there receiving it. That doesn't mean that it's isn't psychologically damaging. Like even if it's unfair, it's still got to be awful, right? And you can put up walls and stuff like that. And I do think that leads to, I'm sure that leads to psychological consequences. And in the worst cases, honestly, what it looks like is something called complex PTSD or CPTSD. So PTSD is post-traumatic stress disorder. And that's like when you have a traumatic event, you can actually develop like a mental illness that's related to the traumatic event. So there are small kinds of traumas, which like Abdu was talking about, like you don't realize how you've been traumatized and it shapes your worldview. That's not PTSD. PTSD is something else. So trauma affects people in multiple ways. Sometimes it just shapes your worldview, which can be really, really damaging. Don't get me wrong. PTSD is a discrete clinical disorder. And then sometimes when you get PTSD time and time and time again, you end up with something called complex PTSD, which really fucks you up. And that's just like a whole different thing that like chronic trauma is very different from like acute trauma. And so there's a huge difference between being sexually assaulted once at a party and having like a family member who rapes you repeatedly, like when you're growing up. And honestly, what I see in some people is that the chronicness of the hate honestly looks like complex PTSD. And in the people who can't really protect themselves, it really warps their view of humanity. It warps their view of themselves. And like, that's just incredibly damaging. And the last thing that I'll say is that I think like people have sort of talked a little bit about the people who are being toxic, which I think is a really, really important discussion. And I personally would love to better understand like where toxicity on the internet comes from. And people have mentioned like anonymity and a couple of other things, but like I really don't know why the internet has become such a hateful place.
It was fucking hot. Okay.